Just over 30 days ago, the CARES Act was signed into law. And what has been the reaction so far in Washington, D.C.?
Great question, Brian. I think if you look at the funding that has already been committed with the CARES Act, with a staggering $2 trillion in funding, what we've already seen is that amount actually was not quite enough. And perhaps that's a statement on the depth and the breadth of this public health and economic crisis. So we saw that Congress has already acted again in April to replenish funding as the needs continue to grow. And that's what we are calling the COVID 3.5 legislation on April 24th that added an additional $484 billion in funding, with about $310 billion of that going toward the Paycheck Protection Program that the SBA is administering. So the importance of public sentiment and politics are important also as oversight begins to take shape here in Washington. The CARES Act calls for oversight at three key levels, just like we saw with TARP oversight. The first is the Congressional Oversight Commission, which also will be a 5-member panel, and its mandate is to conduct oversight of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury's implementation of the Title IV provisions. And it will be required to issue reports every 30 days, with the first report expected at the end of this week. The next leg is the Special Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery, and that special IG is tasked with conducting audits and investigations of the Treasury Secretary's activities under the CARES Act. Third is the government-wide inspector general body, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. This one's a little different because it goes beyond Title IV. It can actually go to any of the legislation that Congress is issuing to respond to the crisis. And it also has subpoena power, and that can include not just the agencies involved in the implementation of these important acts, but also to private entities receiving these funds. All of these three, of course, are what is mentioned by the CARES Act. They also have mandates, important to keep in mind, that extend to 2025. For us in Washington, that's important because, of course, that extends far beyond the November elections. So we will see as the crisis thickens or hopefully starts to dissipate and the politics of Washington continue to evolve, how that may affect the actual execution of oversight. So that's a bit of an unknown still. Keep in mind that this is just what the CARES Act establishes. And of course, we've already seen the House establish an additional oversight committee, and each of the agencies will be carrying out their own mandate. For example, we saw the Department of Justice announce that it is taking an extra look at certain components of this government funding with the PPP program. Naturally, oversight will continue, and that will evolve over the next few years.
Bridget, I think that is a really good overview of both where we are and the level of oversight that we're going to see over the government's intervention to support the economy and the health of the nation over the next several years. If you think about the flow of funds, that is how money that was authorized by the CARES Act and the top-up that you referenced as well. In our last call, we talked about the more hands that this passes through, the more time it will take to get into the hands of the end recipients, and we've seen that as expected. I will say that if you look at what has gone through the banking sector, and in particular the SBA PPP program that, Bridget, you've referenced, we moved relatively quickly. There was a program already dispersed the first $350 billion, now has the top up of additional $310 billion. Clearly some bumps along the road and some changing expectations and requirements between the public sector and the private sector, though actually a fairly expeditious delivery of that assistance. And then next we reference the facilities that the Treasury and Federal Reserve have supported, and those also are getting stood up, but at a slower pace as we had predicted a month ago.
Yeah, Peter, I think the 30 days to accomplish all of that is pretty spectacular.